The Allison V-1710 still holds the world speed record for a propeller-driven boat, a record that stood since 1962 and has never once been broken in over 60 years. And yet, this engine was never designed to go anywhere near water at all. It was built to fly at altitude in a fighter plane, dodging anti-aircraft fire over the Pacific and escorting bombers deep into occupied Europe. So when a group of American boat racers decided the smartest thing to do with a warehouse full of retired warplane engines was rip them out and bolt them backwards into wooden hydroplane holes, most people in the industry thought it was reckless, if not completely suicidal. And the story of how that gamble turned into 40 years of American motorsport dominance is a genuinely insane one. Because to some people, this is a story about American ingenuity and the willingness to go faster than anyone thought possible. But to the families of the drivers who died finding out exactly how far that engine could be pushed, this same era is remembered as one of the deadliest chapters in the history of American sport. So let's get into the wild, true story of the Allison V-1710. Part 1. An engine built to kill, not to race. The Allison V-1710 wasn't designed by racers, and it wasn't designed with racing in mind at all. It came out of the Allison Engineering Company, a division of General Motors based in Indianapolis, and its entire purpose from the very beginning was war. It was a liquid-cooled V12, 12 cylinders split into two banks of 6, displacing 1,710 cubic inches, which is exactly where the name comes from. And by the time the United States entered the Second World War, this engine was sitting in the nose of three of the most recognizable American fighter planes ever built: the Curtiss P-40 Warhawk, the Lockheed P-38 Lightning, and the earliest production runs of the North American P-51 Mustang, before that plane switched over to the British-designed Rolls-Royce Merlin, built under license in America by Packard. Both engines, the Allison and the Merlin, were almost identical on the outside, both liquid-cooled V12s of similar dimensions, both running 2 intake and 2 exhaust valves per cylinder, fired by twin spark plugs off twin magnetos. And in the cockpit of a fighter plane, a healthy example of either one produced somewhere around 1,200 to 1,500 horsepower, which at the time was an almost unbelievable amount of power to be trusting your life to at 20,000 feet with someone actively trying to shoot you down. And for the length of the war, that's all this engine ever needed to be: a piece of war machinery, built to kill or to survive being killed. Nothing more complicated than that. Then in 1945, the war ended, and almost overnight, an engine that had cost the US and British governments somewhere around $45,000 apiece to manufacture during the war became a problem nobody in Indianapolis had planned for, because the planes it powered were suddenly being scrapped by the thousand, and by the early 1950s, the government was selling off surplus Allisons and Merlins for less than $10,000 each, sometimes for far less than that. So you had a precision-built, supercharged, liquid-cooled V12 capable of over 1,000 factory horsepower being sold off like it was scrap metal. Because to the US government at that point, that's basically what it had become. Part 2. The first man crazy enough to try it. Putting a warplane's engine into an American race boat wasn't actually a brand new idea in 1946, because back in the 1920s, the legendary racer Gar Wood had already powered his Miss America hydroplanes with twin Liberty L-12 aircraft engines left over from the First World War. And in 1920, he set a Gold Cup race record of 70.412 miles per hour that stood untouched for the next 26 years. So the sport already had a track record of rating military surplus for horsepower. What changed after the Second World War wasn't the idea itself, it was the scale of it and the ceiling it was about to smash through completely. The man who did it first with the Allison was a racer named Dan Arena, and his boat was called Miss Golden Gate III, a big, wild-riding yellow hull fitted with a substantially stock Allison V-1710 pulled straight out of a retired World War II fighter. And in 1946, Arena entered her in the Gold Cup on the Detroit River. She failed to finish that race, and it genuinely didn't matter, because over the course of that season, Miss Golden Gate III beat the existing competition lap record of 72 miles an hour 7 separate times, and pushed the mark north of 77, one boat in one season, obliterating a record the entire sport had been circling for years. And from that point on, for the next 4 decades, the V12 Allison and the Rolls-Royce Merlin became the standard engines of what the sport now called unlimited hydroplane racing, a class with literally no restriction on engine displacement, because up until that point, nobody had ever imagined a restriction would be necessary. By 1947, the Dawson brothers of Detroit had entered their own Allison-powered boat, Miss Peps 5, driven by Danny Foster, and she swept both major national titles that year, the Gold Cup and the National High Point Championship. So within a single season of Arena proving the concept worked, the Allison wasn't a novelty stunt anymore. It was the new baseline every serious team had to match. Part 3. What they actually did to this engine. Here's the part of this story that should genuinely stop you for a second, because of exactly what these racers had to do to a piece of precision aviation hardware just to get it into a boat at all. And it's stranger than most people who've heard the words hydroplane racing ever realize. To go from an airplane to a boat, the Allison had to be installed backwards, because in a plane, the propeller sits at the front of the engine, pulling the aircraft forward through thin, high-altitude air. And in a hydroplane, the drive had to run rearward into a submerged gearbox and propeller shaft. So racers physically flipped the entire installation around, running the engine in reverse rotation from how it left the factory floor, with the supercharger itself mounted upside down from its original factory position. And somehow, against every instinct an engineer would have about a machine this precise, it worked. It actually worked. And that's the detail that should stick with you. In its aircraft configuration, a healthy Allison was putting out around 1,200 to 1,500 horsepower, but in a hydroplane, pushed by racers with no factory warranty left to void and nothing left to lose, a typical race-tuned Allison was producing over 3,000 horsepower at roughly 3,000 revolutions per minute in short bursts, because that kind of output could not be sustained for long without the entire engine needing a rebuild. And teams were routinely spinning these things up past 4,000 revolutions per minute, more than double the cruising speed the factory had ever intended it to see inside a fighter plane's cockpit. And then there was the quill shaft, a thin connecting rod linking the supercharger to the rest of the power unit, transmitting all of the violence of a 3,000 horsepower V12 through one slender piece of metal. And racers who lived through this era will tell you the quill shaft probably eliminated more boats from competition than any other single component in the entire history of the sport. And the Rolls-Royce Merlin had almost the exact same story with its own 2-stage, 2-speed supercharger drivetrain, which made more power than the Allison's simpler single-stage blower, but was far more likely to end a race weekend with a boat being towed back to the pits in pieces. That's the trade the entire sport was built around for the better part of 30 years, the Allison being durable, plentiful, and forgiving, and the Merlin being faster and better supercharged at the cost of being genuinely temperamental. And the best-funded teams gravitated toward the Merlin because the extra power was worth chasing, while everybody else stuck with Allisons because an Allison that broke down on a Saturday could usually be fixed in time to race again by Monday. Part 4. Flying on the water. In 1950, a Seattle racer named Ted Jones changed the sport almost as much as Dan Arena's first Allison had. His boat, Slow Motion 4, was 28.5 feet long, running on an Allison. And while she wasn't technically the first unlimited hydroplane to run on a semi-submerged, pro-priding propeller, she was the first to turn that concept into an actual championship, winning all 3 heats of the 1950 Gold Cup on the Detroit River. And later that same year, on Lake Washington off Seattle, she set a new world water speed record of 160.323 miles per hour, smashing a mark that had stood for over a decade by almost 20 miles an hour in a single run. For the next 20 years, if a team wanted to compete at the front of this sport, they had to build a boat that rode the way Slow Motion 4 rode, with the majority of the hull barely touching the water at all, held up not by buoyancy, but by the same aerodynamic principle that keeps an airplane in the sky. Which, if you want to be precise about it, means these boats weren't really boats in any conventional sense anymore. They were airplanes that happened to skim across a lake instead of flying above one. Built and piloted by men who mostly weren't trained engineers at all, just obsessive amateurs with a dangerous amount of nerve and a warehouse full of cheap fighter engines to draw from. Ted Jones's own son, Ron Jones Sr., carried the family business forward, pioneering the modern forward cockpit cab-over-hull design in the 1960s. And in 1986, he became the first designer in the sport to install an actual F-16 fighter jet safety canopy onto an unlimited hydroplane. Because by that point, everyone building these machines understood exactly what they were building. Not a boat with a powerful engine bolted into it, but a fighter plane's cockpit and a fighter plane's engine, reunited, minus the wings. Part 5. The part of the story the sport doesn't like talking about. Here's the thing this sport never fully escaped, no matter how much money got poured into it or how sophisticated the hulls became. And it's the part of the Allison story that turns this from a fun piece of Americana into something a lot darker. Between the 1960s and the early 1980s, unlimited hydroplane racing killed people. And it killed some of the best drivers the sport ever produced. 7 drivers were fatally injured in the 1960s alone. 3 more died in the 1970s. And then in less than 12 months, between October 1981 and July 1982, the sport lost its 2 most successful drivers in history back to back. Bill Munsey, the winningest driver the sport had ever seen, with 62 career victories, a man nicknamed Mr. Unlimited, was leading the final heat of the World Championship race in Acapulco, Mexico on October 18, 1981, traveling at 175 miles an hour, when his boat suffered what the sport calls a blowover, the bow lifting off the water until the entire hull flips backward through the air. And Munsey was thrown from the cockpit and suffered injuries that would prove fatal. Less than 10 months later, on July 31, 1982, 4-time Gold Cup champion Dean Chenoweth was piloting the famous Miss Budweiser during a qualifying run on the Columbia River near the Tri-Cities in Washington State, again traveling around 175 miles an hour, when the same nightmare happened again. The bow lifted, the boat went vertical, and it slammed back down into the water upside down, crushing Chenoweth inside the cockpit. He was pulled from the wreckage unconscious with no pulse, and was pronounced dead less than an hour later at just 44 years old. 2 of the greatest drivers the sport had ever produced, gone within 10 months of each other in the exact same type of accident. And up until that point, drivers in this sport raced with no roof, no enclosed cockpit, and for most of its history, no seatbelt at all, because nobody had ever been forced to reckon with what actually happens when a boat pulling 3,000 horsepower out of a converted fighter engine goes airborne at 175 miles an hour. Until it happened to 2 champions in less than a year, and the entire sport had no choice left but to change. Insert your own mid-video plug here, for example. Before we get into how the sport responded to this, if you're new here, this is Liberty Works, and we tell stories exactly like this one every week. So if you haven't already, go ahead and hit subscribe. Keep it under 15 seconds, and cut back into the story on a cliffhanger, the way Magnates does. Part 6. What it actually took to make this safer. After Chenoweth's death, Miss Budweiser's owner, Bernie Little, ordered his team to build an enclosed safety canopy for the cockpit, and within a few years, that canopy, borrowed directly from F-16 fighter jet design, became mandatory across every boat in the sport by 1987. And it's worth sitting with the fact that it took the deaths of the sport's 2 biggest stars back-to-back in less than a year for an enclosed cockpit to become standard equipment in a sport running fighter plane engines at 175 miles an hour, with drivers sitting in open air, no different from how it had been done since Dan Arena first tried it in 1946. The corporate money kept coming in either way, and it had already been coming in for 2 decades by that point. Bernie Little had introduced the first in a long line of Miss Budweiser hydroplanes in 1964, backed by Anheuser-Busch, and that program alone would go on to win 141 races between 1966 and 2004, while another dominant program, Bill Munsey's Atlas Van Lines, won 24 of the 34 races it entered between 1976 and 1979. And none of that corporate polish and sponsorship money changed what was sitting under the engine cover. Well into the 1980s, if you cracked open a championship-caliber unlimited hydroplane, you were still looking at a V-12 that in a previous life had been trying to shoot down or outrun the Luftwaffe. Not every attempt to move past the warplane engine went well either. In 1956, a Seattle contractor named Lyle Parks entered a boat called Miss Skyway, powered by a pair of stock 265 cubic inch 1956 Chevrolet Corvette engines mounted side by side, sending power to the propeller shaft through a rubber V-belt drive. And racers immediately nicknamed her the Rubber Band Boat. And with maybe 500 horsepower combined against Allison's pushing 3,000, she was hopelessly outmatched and was refitted with an actual Allison inside of 2 years. And a handful of teams tried the opposite approach and doubled down. In 1954, a boat called Miss Wayne installed a pair of Allisons side by side, driving contra-rotating propellers. And Jack Schaefer insisted on the same tandem layout for most of his such crust boats. And nearly every one of those tandem installations was plagued by gearbox failures, with the single celebrated exception being a boat called Miss Pepsi, which somehow made twin Allisons genuinely competitive when almost nobody else could. Part 7. The engine that replaced the fighter plane. By the early 1970s, the sport was looking for a way out of the piston era entirely, not just for safety reasons, but because parts for a 30-year-old fighter engine were getting harder and more expensive to find every season. And in 1974, an entrepreneur named Jim Clapp secured special permission from the sport's governing body to try something nobody had raced with before. Instead of one enormous V-12, his new boat, the U-95, would run on twin Lycoming T-53 gas turbines, the exact same turboshaft engines used to power the Bell UH-1 Huey helicopters that had just spent a decade flying over Vietnam, each turbine weighing only 465 pounds and producing 1,700 horsepower, meaning the U-95 was putting out 3,400 horsepower combined, more than either an Allison or a Merlin could manage, even in the most abusive race tune, for roughly 2/3 the weight of a single-piston V-12. The debut went badly. One of the twin turbines suffered a catastrophic disc failure, the spinning metal fragments punching straight through the engine casing and the underside of the hull with enough force to nearly cut the boat in half. And the only reason it didn't split apart completely was that the second turbine sitting right next to the one that failed happened to absorb enough of the impact to hold the structure together. The boat sank, and driver Leif Borgerson managed to climb out of the open cockpit before it went under and survived without serious injury. And in direct response to that incident, the sport started wrapping turbine sections in Kevlar blankets, specifically to contain a future disc failure before it could tear through a hull again. The next team to try turbine power didn't show up again until 1980, when the Pay and Pack team tested one on the Columbia River and flipped 2.5 times during a pre-race test run. And even after 2 frightening false starts, the sport kept coming back to the idea because the math was simply too good to ignore. And then in 1984, the Atlas Van Lines team debuted with a single Lycoming T-55 turbine, the same engine family used in the Vietnam-era Chinook helicopter. And on its very first competitive lap around the buoys at Evansville, Indiana, it set a new world 2-mile lap record that was already faster than the existing 2.5-mile record. And that was the moment. From 1984 onward, it was only a matter of time before the Allison, the Merlin, and the rarer Rolls-Royce Griffin, a handful of teams had also experimented with, all faded into history, the same way an earlier generation of piston aircraft engines had faded a generation before them. But the old engine didn't leave quietly, and it wasn't finished setting records on its way out the door. In 1962, an Allison-powered boat called Miss US-1, driven by Roy Doobie, set a mile straightaway record of 200.419 miles an hour at Guntersville, Alabama, the first propeller-driven boat in history to ever break 200 miles an hour. And that record for a piston-powered boat has never been beaten, not once in over 60 years. Part 8. What's left of it today? Today, almost every boat racing in H1 Unlimited, the modern successor to the sport those old Gold Cup racers built, runs on a Lycoming T-55 turbine pulled from a retired Chinook helicopter. And the whoosh has replaced the growl almost entirely. Almost, because as of the most recent seasons, there has still been exactly one holdout. The U3, campaigned by Go3 Racing, the last unlimited hydroplane on the entire circuit, still running a piston engine at all, a twin-turbocharged Allison V-12, the direct descendant of the very same fighter plane engine Dan Arena bolted into Miss Golden Gate III back in 1946. And every other team in the fleet gave up the piston engine 40 years ago. One team, for reasons that have very little to do with logic and a great deal to do with stubbornness, never did. So depending on how you look at it, this is either one of the great, scrappy stories of American motorsport ingenuity, a group of guys who looked at a pile of leftover World War II engines and figured out how to turn them into the fastest thing on water in the country, breaking records that in some cases have never been broken since. Or it's a story about a sport that let corporate sponsors and stubborn drivers push an unproven, unreliable, wildly overpowered engine design past the point of safety for almost 40 years before it finally cost two of its biggest stars their lives within a year of each other. And it genuinely took both of those deaths happening back to back before anybody enclosed the cockpit at all. Let me know what you think in the comments, because there's clearly an argument for both sides here. But there's no denying that from a pure engineering and motorsport perspective, what these teams pulled off with a piece of retired war machinery is one of the wildest stories in American racing history. And if you want another one just like it, go check out the story we did on You've Probably Never Heard It, and I think you're going to love it. Thanks for watching Liberty Works, and I'll see you in the next one.